Slope is a useful idea in mathematics. It describes how quickly the y variable changes as the x variable changes. And x and y here refer to the x and y coordinates on the coordinate plane. If we have a line drawn on the coordinate plane, and we look at any 2 points on that line, we can calculate the slope by identifying the change in x between the 2 points and the change in y between the 2 points. And we want to look at those two changes and compare them using a ratio. So more specifically, the slope is a ratio between the change in y and the change in x. And here I'm using the Greek letter delta to indicate change. Thinking of those coordinates, we can look at the difference using subtraction to calculate the change between the y coordinates and between the corresponding x coordinates. So in formulas, the slope, it is a number, and the letter m is used to represent that. We also sometimes use the phrase rise over run to help us remember that when we think about slope, the vertical changes are up top in the ratio, and the horizontal changes, the change in x, is in the denominator. So thinking about slope, there are a few possibilities. Slope, again, is a number. If the graph, if our line is going up from left to right, that number is going to be positive. If the line is going down from left to right, the number that represents slope is going to be negative. And if the line is simply flat, as we look at it from left to right, if it doesn't go up or down, we end up with a very special type of line. It's called a horizontal line. And for a horizontal line, the slope is going to equal 0. And these three situations make a lot of sense because, well, let's start with the case of the horizontal line. The slope is 0 because for a horizontal line there is no change in the y-coordinate. So the y-coordinate equals 0. There is change. The x-coordinate does change, so the x-coordinate is not 0. And whenever we have 0 in the top of a fraction and something that's not equal to 0 in the bottom of a fraction, we end up with 0. Simply 0 overall. Now let's take a second look at the other two possibilities here, positive and negative values for slope. In the case of a positive value for slope, the line is increasing from left to right, so as the x-coordinate increases, so does the y-coordinate. And because they're both moving in the same direction, that means that in our formula, if the change in x that we calculate is positive, so will the change in y be positive. And if the change in x is negative based on the 2 points that we choose, then the change in y is also going to be negative. So we end up with a positive slope value overall. And if the line goes down left to right, the opposite happens. If we have a positive calculation for x, we end up with a negative difference between the y-coordinates. So we end up with a negative slope. Now there's one more possibility for slope that we need to consider. If a line goes straight up and down, which means that the x-coordinate never changes, we call it a vertical line. And in this case, the slope is undefined. Because if you think about, again, our formula for slope, delta y over delta x, the change in y, divided by the change in x, in this case, the y-coordinates can change, but the x-coordinates never change. So we can move up and down, we can change the vertical coordinate, the y-coordinate, but we never move left or right. We're always in that same spot. And so we end up with 0 in the denominator, which we can't make sense of that. We can't come up with a number for that. So we have an undefined slope. And that's an important distinction to remember and to think about, because it's easy to confuse the difference between a vertical line having an undefined slope and a horizontal line which has a slope of 0. So it's important to take some time to think about these two situations. A vertical line and a horizontal line, they seem similar. They are both kind of special situations, but they are also very different. A vertical line never changes its horizontal position, and so the idea of slope doesn't make sense because slope describes how quickly the vertical coordinates change as the horizontal coordinates change. And so if the horizontal coordinates never change, we can't really deal with that in terms of coming up with a number for slope. On the other hand, with a horizontal line, we can change our horizontal position, but the vertical position then never changes. And so 0 is the perfect number to represent the fact that the vertical position never changes. It takes time to think about those distinctions and make the connection between a vertical line and an undefined slope, and a horizontal line and a 0 slope.